into my problem with the phone. Good, thank you, everybody. I just want to briefly revise one of the important lessons that we learned last week. And then I'm going to go on actually with a Mishnah, with the next Mishnah. It means we'll have missed out a few lines, which are not relevant really, but gives us the whole theme that we've learned since the previous Mishnah. And then we'll pick up the next Mishnah, which is in the middle of Mem Beis Amud Aleph. But just to, outside the Gemara, revise the lesson. If you remember, the Mishnah we started to learn a few weeks ago, and the discussion was all on that Mishnah, was about taking Arba Minim on a Shabbat. When there was a Beis HaMikdash, then the Lulav and Esrog used to be taken all 7 days. And it was taken even on a Shabbat. There was no decree as then not to take it on a Shabbat. And the Mishnah said that in order to fulfill the mitzvah and at the same time to avoid carrying the Lulav and Esrog in the street to get to Shul, the general custom in Yerushalayim was that people brought them Lulavim and Esrogim into the Shul on a Friday afternoon before Shabbat, left them there. And on the Shabbat morning, they used to pick up their own Lulav and Esrog, and then they would make a bracha, and they would leave it at Shul. So they wouldn't carry it to Shul, but nevertheless, they would be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Arba Minim, even on Shabbos, and include in that the shakings for the Hallel and so on. But you're not allowed to carry the Lulav and Esrog through the street because there is a malacha of carrying on Shabbos. And of course, that presupposed the situation there was no Eruv in Yerushalayim. We briefly discussed why that should have been so, but it seems that there was no Eruv in Yerushalayim that would have allowed carrying of the Arba Minim through the streets. The Mishnah said at the back end of the Mishnah, which is where the discussion went to last week in the Gemara, that if a person wishing to carry his Lulav and Esrog to Shul on the Shabbos morning, forgetting the fact that he can't carry it at the time when you would perform the mitzvah of the Lulav and Esrog on the Shabbos, if he was started to carry it, he went through his front door and onto the street outside, he would, even though he has violated one of the Isurim of Shabbat, in other words, the malacha of carrying in the street, nevertheless, he would not have to bring a korban chatos as a kapara. He would not have to bring an atonement offering. And of course, the general situation is that if a person violates a serious prohibition, any serious prohibition, but particularly the prohibitions of Shabbos, he cooks on Shabbos, or he carries on Shabbos, of course, is what we're talking about now. And he does so unwittingly. In other words, he doesn't realize that he shouldn't be doing it. Then this is what's called a violation b'shogeg, not intentional. Then he has to normally bring a kapara. If you're carrying some object on a Shabbos into the street, then even though you may not have done so intentionally, there's still the need for some form of atonement. And a korban chatas was the korban he would have to bring at the time of the Beis HaMikdash as an atonement for his error. However, the Mishnah added this particular important waiver, and that is that if what you're carrying into the street unwittingly was a Maisa mitzvah, was itself a mitzvah article, and you were engaged mentally in that mitzvah, then you would not have to bring a korban chatos as a kapara. You would not have to bring a kapara at all. You wouldn't have to atone, even though you have committed a violation, because you shouldn't have brought the Lulav and Esrog into the street. Since what you took into the street was a Lulav and Esrog and not a cup of coffee, you don't have to bring the korban chatos. You bring a korban chatos if you've carried unwittingly a cup of coffee into the street, but not if you've carried the Lulav and Esrog. So anything which is, if you like, involving you in a mitzvah, even though that mitzvah should not be the one you should be doing now, but since there is a mitzvah excuse in your carrying, we say that absolves you from the need of bringing a korban kapara. And there's a little bit of logic in there. After all, why do you bring a korban for kapara? Because you have negligently violated a law in the Torah, and you've done what you want to do, and you've done so negligently in violation of the law. But if what you've negligently done is to take out something which itself is a mitzvah, then it lessens the severity and the gravity of what you've done. At least in your mind, you thought you were engaged in a mitzvah, even though in fact you shouldn't have been engaged in that way at all. You shouldn't be carrying it. Nevertheless, that is somehow, it rescues you from the severity of the aver, and therefore you don't need a korban chatos. That was the principle we learned at the end of the Mishnah. And it's a general principle. It's not just a person who carries out a lulav and esrog, but any error that's made in relation to a mitzvah, which took up your mind when you committed the violation, would absolve you of the need to bring a korban to atone for that violation. This is just one example of the taking out a lulav and esrog. Okay, now we're going to actually go on to the next Mishnah, and this Mishnah is in the middle of 42a, Mem Beis Amud Aleph, fairly much in the middle of the page. Mekabeles Isha Miyad Bena, after the big bold print of Mem Tov Nun Yud Mas Nisin. And this Mishnah is really quite a break from what we were doing previously. And it takes us into some more miscellany about the way you look after and what you can do with your lulav when you come home after you've used it, and whether muktzah applies, various other categories of issa. We're not involved here about carrying on Shabbos. We're not going to be involved about how you do the mitzvah lulav and esrog, making a bracha. This is a complete break. It's a different subject. So let's get our teeth into this one as well. The Mishnah says here, Mekabeles Isha miyad bena umiyad bala. Let's read these statements first, and we may have to see what the big deal is for each expression one at a time. Mekabeles Isha miyad bena umiyad bala. A woman may receive into her hands a lulav, although it doesn't say it means a lulav, it's definitely talking about the lulav from her son or from her husband after they've made a bracha on the lulav. Umachazira tolamayim, and then she, having made her own, or whatever, shaken it or whatever she's done, she may return it into the water. Afilu b'Shabbos, even on Shabbos, b'Shabbos it says, which means even on Shabbos. What are the issues here? So the Mishnah here is actually relating to a number of issues which are not at all obvious. I know they become a little bit more obvious when we look at the Gemara later on, or if you look at Rashi and the Mefarshim, but it doesn't seem to be telling us anything of any material interest. That she may take it from her son and her husband. What does it mean? She may take the lulav even on a Shabbos from her son and her husband. So the scenario over here is that the woman, the son or the husband, have fulfilled their mitzvah lulav and esrog, and it's a Shabbos, shall we say, and they're allowed to do that on a Shabbos. As we said, at a time that you would take lulav and esrog from Shabbos, it was like any other day of Yom Tov as far as the mitzvah was concerned. And having discharged their mitzvah, the husband or the son can hand it over to the woman, the mother or the wife, and it's not going to be a problem. What might be the problem? The problem might be muktzah, the Gemara is going to say later on. Muktzah, something that she shouldn't handle on Shabbos, something that someone shouldn't handle on Shabbos is muktzah. Muktzah, as we know, is a din d'rabbanan. It's a rabbinical prohibition, or shall we say a set of prohibitions that prohibit people on Shabbos from taking hold or moving objects around, which they should not be moving around on Shabbos. And muktzah is quite complicated and quite very much, shall we say, obstructive to what we can do on Shabbos. It doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily be doing a malacha with any object, but the object itself becomes something you shouldn't move, even if you don't use it at all. Now, there are a number of categories of muktzah, just before we see what the issue is with this particular situation of the lulav. There are a number of categories of muktzah. It's quite a complicated topic. One knows the category of taking, I mean, you wouldn't take a sewing machine on Shabbos, or you wouldn't pick up an electronic phone or whatever it is, or a drill, something which is attached to the electricity, which we might turn on by mistake, is muktzah. Something which is used only for a melacha generally, something which on Shabbos would be osa, for a forbidden activity, shall we say a pen, which is only used for writing, that's muktzah, because it has no use on Shabbos other than for a forbidden activity. So we are not allowed to move a pen either. If it's on the table, not allowed to move it either. There are exceptions for which we can move it. Let me ignore those exceptions for the moment and just take the general principle. But one isn't allowed to move these objects which have no function in the Shabbos, or the function is only one for a malacha. But then there's another category of muktzah, which in a sense is even more severe, which is objects that have no function at all on Shabbos, neither for a malacha or for anything else. They simply have no interest. So, for example, a stone which you see on the ground in your garden is muktzah. You shouldn't pick it up and move it around unless you've dedicated that stone for some other purpose. But if you hadn't, then that stone is muktzah, simply muktzah, and you shouldn't move it on Shabbos. Something that has no function, or something which has a function, but it is a forbidden function on Shabbos, is muktzah. They're actually muktzah in different categories, but they're both muktzah. One isn't allowed to move them around. The Mishnah has an issue over here. So we have the father or the son having made a bracha on the lulav and esrog. They had a mitzvah to perform, because the mitzvah of lulav and esrog, remember, formally is a time-bound mitzvah. The mitzvah is aseh shazman groma. You only have to bench lulav and esrog on Sukkot. So therefore, it's obviously a classic example of a time-bound mitzvah. Since it's a time-bound mitzvah, in theory, based upon the law of time-bound mitzvahs and non-time-bound mitzvahs, a woman is not bound and obligated in the mitzvah of Arba Minim. We'll talk about what she does as a custom nowadays. Let's put that out of the way for the moment. Formally, she's not bound by the mitzvah of Arba Minim, and therefore she has really no mitzvah to bench on the lulav and esrog. So therefore, we have a bit of an issue. Supposing the father and the son have finished their bracha, if they hand this lulav now over to the wife, the mother, the daughter, the sister, whoever, it's muktzah for her, isn't it? Because she has no function with it. It wasn't muktzah for them because they had a mitzvah to perform. They had a function, but she has no function with this lulav and esrog, and therefore it should be muktzah. Nevertheless, the Mishnah says, now we see what is the chiddush here, that mekabelas isha miyad beno miyad bala on Shabbos, the woman is allowed to take it from her husband and from her son, despite the fact that we might have a problem here. The Mishnah says this isn't a problem. Why isn't it a problem? We'll see. Isn't a problem because the woman also can perform a mitzvah. She can make a bracha on it, or we'll see what the alternatives are a little bit later on. So she can perform a mitzvah on it, and whatever mitzvah she has, even if it's not a mitzvah min haTorah, is sufficient to take it out of the category of an object that has no function for her. It has a function for her, even if it's a lesser function than it has for a man. This is different. She may even return it into the water. What water? People used to put their lulavim into a vase of water to preserve it when they came home from shul. Everybody has a different way of looking after their lulav when they come home from shul. Some wrap it in a wet towel, some leave it in silver foil, some put it into a cool, dark place. But originally, the classic thing to do was to take off the package from the bottom, then the other 2 minim, and put the lulav itself, the spine of the lulav, to stand upright, rather like an umbrella in an umbrella stand. They would put it into this vase and it would keep it fresh. She's allowed to do that on Shabbos. And that is a little bit of a chiddush as well, because You might think it looks a bit like planting. You know, you're not allowed to plant on Shabbos. You're not allowed to water flowers on Shabbos. Remember that this is not formally a problem of watering a flower on Shabbos, because these are detached plants. A lulav is a detached plant. It is not going to grow when you put it in water, unlike something which is attached to the ground. So therefore, formally, again, and legalistically, there's no problem with adding it to the water. But because it looks a little bit like planting or sowing or watering your flowers, therefore, you might have thought there was a problem. So this Mishnah is giving you another waiver and saying that's not a problem. She may take it, despite the fact it looks a bit like muktzah. It may be sort of half muktzah for her because she doesn't have a real obligation. And she may put it into the water, even though it looks a little bit as though she's watering a flower. So now we understand that first phrase. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, let's just go on in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda adds something really. And he says, he just layers some of these heterim, the things that are allowed. And he says, by Shabbos machazirin, on Shabbos, if it is Shabbos Sukkos, then she is allowed, as we've just learned at the beginning of the Mishnah, to replace the lulav after use in the vase of water to keep it fresh. And then he adds two more riders. The Yom Tov Mosifin, on Yom Tov. What does that mean on Yom Tov? We're talking about Yom Tov Sukkos, but Yom Tov which isn't Shabbos. In other words, the first day of Yom Tov, shall we say, which isn't Shabbos, which doesn't fall on a Shabbos. Mosifin, you may even add water to the existing water that you have. You know what happens, water begins to evaporate, or you may want some fresh water because the water is already not of a good state to keep the lulav fresh. You may add, in other words, you may top up, not replace, top up water on a Yom Tov. Why? Because we are less makbid, we are less particular about the halachas of muktzah on Yom Tov in some categories than we are on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, all you can do is place it in the original water, and you mustn't change the water on Shabbos, Rabbi Yehuda says. When it comes to replacing it into the water on Yom Tov, which isn't Shabbos, you may actually top up the water. We are a little bit more lenient. Uba moed, and if it's chola moed, well, chola moed, there's no problem at all. Machlifin, you should replace the water completely. In other words, this is just a recommendation that on chola moed, if you're using this system to keep a lulav fresh, pour out the old water every day and replace it with new water, and that way you have the optimal refreshment characteristic for the conditions for the lulav. So he's sort of layered here what you can do with the water. Again, what's the problem with the water over here? I mean, think about it for a moment. If you can put it into water, why should there be a different halacha for Yom Tov? If you can replace it in its original water on Shabbos, why is it in Yom Tov you can do a bit more, and on Chol HaMoed you should do a complete replace? I mean, if it's already a problem, what we're showing to put it this way, if it isn't a problem to replace it in its original water, then you should be able to make a change of water as well. Why aren't you allowing a change of water on Shabbos? Why aren't you allowing a top up of water? If we're already saying you can replace it into the water, that's already the most problematic part, because you're placing the lulav into water. Having been allowed to do that, why shouldn't you be allowed to do the top up or the full replacement on a Shabbos as well? Where is there an extra level of transgression? And the answer is there isn't. So why are there these three different levels? Shabbos, you can only replace, you turn it into its original water. On Yom Tov, you're allowed to top up but not replace. But on Chol HaMoed, you may even replace. Why have these three different levels of permitted lulav returns? So the Mefarshim say it's got to do with tircha, a surprising thing. It's in terms of the amount of trouble we permit you to go into. On a Shabbos, we should try and minimize the tircha. Tircha means the effort. And so therefore on a Shabbos, we say you should return it into its original water and no messing around. On a Yom Tov, you're allowed to do a bit more tircha. Don't forget, on a Yom Tov, you're allowed to cook and carry outside. So you're already doing more tircha than you can on a Shabbos. So that's allowed to you. So therefore, you're allowed to go one stage further in your troubles and actually top up the water, which means go into the well or wherever it was. It wasn't so easy as just going to the sink and topping up. On Chol HaMoed, then you should actually change the water completely. You don't have a problem with tircha at all. But on Yom Tov, you're allowed a little bit of tircha, but not a lot of tircha. On Shabbos, you're allowed no tircha almost. And that's the formal answer as to why there are these distinctions made over here. I find it all a bit difficult because these differences in tircha seem to me to be fairly small in relation to many other forms of tircha that you're allowed to do on a Shabbos. And to say somehow that just adding a bit of water takes you over the edge seems to me a bit strange. We do a lot more tirchatic things on a Shabbos than adding water to a flask or whatever it is. So I myself don't understand the extent of particularity we are here on tircha, when we are really fairly easygoing. As you know, on a Shabbos, if you want to rearrange the furniture, you can rearrange the furniture. Well, how much tircha? But we don't have a din on Shabbos that says you can't move chairs around. But if they're in a certain position, you have to fix them. And to me, it seems there's more tircha involved in moving the chairs around than there is adding another inch of water onto your vase where you're storing the lulav. But then maybe some people's vases were heavier, or maybe the well was further away. I don't know. Anyway, this is the way in which the commentaries explain it. And let's just do the last statement in the Mishnah, which is really like the odd man out. But the Gemara is going to discuss this, and it's an important aspect of halacha. Koton hayodea lenanea. Nothing to do with Shabbos or anything here. Here we're talking about how do you bring up your children. Koton hayodea lenanea. A cotton, someone who's, let's say, under a mitzvah, although there'll be some discussion about what this really means. But he already knows this. The Mishnah itself tries to define the age of the individual by means of what he is capable of understanding. Hayodea lenanea, who knows how to do the na'anu'im. He knows how to do the shakes. In other words, he knows when it comes to Hallel, he understands he's got to do forward, sideways, back, up and down, and all this sort of stuff, whatever his minig is. He doesn't just know how to hold the lulav and esrog. He even knows how to do the additional parts of shaking in Hallel. Chayav lulav, the lulav, is obligated from that age to take the lulav. Now, this is a huge area of halacha because there are many statements in the Gemara about when a child needs to be able, it becomes in some way obligated to do certain types of mitzvah, and they depend upon the type of mitzvah. Over here, a criterion is being given to us for lulav and esrog, which seems to say that before a child is of an age that they know how to do the na'anuim without help, that child doesn't have a need for his own lulav and esrog, or he doesn't need even to have it handed to him on the sukkos by his father. However, as soon as he knows how to do the na'anuim, it takes him over to a point where he is now obligated to shake lulav and esrog. What do we mean by obligated? As we'll see later on, it doesn't mean he's obligated like an adult, because you're only obligated as an adult when you're bar mitzvah. But it means that there is a mitzvah of chinuch on him, that he's obligated to do the mitzvah, and every year he should be doing this mitzvah, obviously supported by his parents. Why? Because there is a din of chinuch. Chinuch is the education and the rearing of a child so that he or she has the correct values and builds up the knowledge necessary to be able to grow up as a Torah observant adult. And the real time that this bites, if you like, as far as lulav and esrog is concerned, is when he reaches the age of chinuch. Now, there's a lot of actually bits and glosses on this Mishnah, although it seems fairly straightforward, really, with a few details. There's quite a lot of extras. Let's just, for a moment, look at this koton hayodea lenanea, chayav lulav. But Gemara is going to bring other examples of when a child is obligated to do various types of mitzvah, and will depend upon what that particular mitzvah is. But over here, the Mishnah is used as a criterion for lulav and esrog being able to shake the na'anuim. Now that's actually quite strange. This is actually quite strange. Remember, as we've learned previously, that the mitzvah lulav and esrog, the basic mitzvah, is simply to pick up the arba minim, and well, we make a bracha on them. The bracha isn't the ikar; it's a topple. The bracha is a nice addition. The ikar of the mitzvah is that he should hold them lulav and esrog. We've said before, as soon as you pick it up, there's a real concern that you've already fulfilled the mitzvah. There, if you pick it up upside down, or you pick it up with a negative kavana, all those things that we talked about before, because it is the picking up of a lulav and esrog in an upright position which fulfills the mitzvah. If that's the case, why should a criterion for a child having to perform mitzvah lulav and esrog be to do with the na'anuim? The na'anuim are a tail end exercise. The na'anuim, the shapings we do, are simply a rabbinic requirement. They're not the Torah mitzvah. So why is it that we only begin to educate him properly in the Torah mitzvah when he's capable of doing the na'anuim? Don't forget, the na'anuim are going to require an extra level of maturity. He has to know to go, right, left, back, up and down in a certain order without support. That's what it means. He knows how to do the na'anuim himself. That means he has to reach a slightly higher age than someone who simply knows how to pick up a lulav and esrog. Why doesn't the Mishnah simply say a child who knows how to hold a lulav in his right hand and an esrog in his left hand, hold it vertically for 4 seconds, he is obligated? Isn't that more obvious? Because that is the Maisa mitzvah, not the na'anuim. So this troubled some of the commentaries. It seems to be a strange thing to make the criterion dependent upon a minority part, a minor part of the mitzvah, rather than the major part of the mitzvah. So the Netziv, the Lashon, he suggests that when it comes to chinuch, and this is actually a very important principle, I think we learned from his answer, when it comes to chinuch, we should be mechanech the child at the young age to do a mitzvah properly and fulsomely. And since as an adult, he will be performing the mitzvah not only with the main part of the mitzvah, which is the picking up, but also with a na'anuim, that the chinuch stage should also be with a child being brought in to the na'anuim as well as the picking up. The whole package should be something he's taught. And until he's ready to do the package, since that's the whole package he'll be formally doing as an adult, that's the package he should be trained in. When he's too young to understand the na'anuim, then it's too early to train him, because you only be training him with one aspect of the mitzvah, even though it's the main aspect. It's not the whole mitzvah that he'll be engaged in as an adult. You want to give him the whole mitzvah. You don't want to give him just 80% of the mitzvah. And therefore, we rather not train him at all until he's capable of doing the whole mitzvah. In other words, in a sense, what we're saying is when it comes to training a child in a mitzvah, you don't give him some childish aspect that he might understand. He has to be trained properly, which is why they say that, it's maybe not such a good thing to give a young infant, one of these foam lulavim and esrogim. And when you do get him a lulav and esrog, and they're quite young, you should get him a kosher one. It may not be a high quality, it may not be a mehudar, but it should be kosher, because we should make every effort so that the chinuch process reflects the way the mitzvah will be done when he's an adult. After all, isn't that the whole definition of education? You don't educate in part, you should educate in a holistic way. And therefore, we want him to be able to do the na'anuim. That's what the Netziv says to explain this. The Kotan HaYodeh L'Na'aneh. I just want to add another aspect here when it comes to chinuch here. The terminology in the Mishnah, as it is in almost every case we read these similar halachas in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, seems misleading. Let's do that last line again. Kotan HaYodeh L'Na'aneh. A minor, a child who knows how to shake. Chayov lulav. He has a mitzvah to take the lulav. And as I said, it's Rabbanon. We can't make him obligated. He doesn't have he's not a bar das. He doesn't have the mature mind to be able to do a mitzvah in Torah, but he has a rabbinic requirement. What do we mean by that? Is the child really the one on whom this mitzvah is incumbent? Or is it the father, the parent? If you read the Mishnah, I'm afraid it's very clear it's the child. It says, Koton hayodenananea chayov. That cotton is obligated to take a lulav. Well, that's news. That's news to most people. We all thought that the mitzvah of chinuch was on the parent. What does that mean, to educate? Who educates? Does a child educate himself? Of course not. The mitzvah of chinuch is incumbent on the parent. It says, "V'shinam tom levonecha v'dibarta bom." Right? The parent has to teach the child. So it should have said, "Kotam hayodea lananea chayav aviv lelamdo mitzvahs lulav." That's how I would have written this Mishnah. That the father is obligated. So this has caused quite a lot of discussion as well amongst the Rishonim and the Mefarshim. The fact that very often the way in which it's stated here in the Mishnah suggests that it is the child. And here you have a 5-year-old child who knows how to shake and he's obligated. When you say someone's obligated, that means that if they don't discharge their obligation, that they've fallen short and maybe they've committed a sin. Can you really blame a child and say, you were obligated and you didn't do that? You're going to have to bring a carbon, or we're going to hit you around the neck or something. Certainly not. So there is a view. There are various ways to try and understand it. The classic understanding is that this phraseology is not to be taken literally, and it means the father. And when it says chayav lulav, it means chayav oviv. It just doesn't say so. The father is obligated in the mitzvah of lulav. The chayav father is obligated in all the mitzvahs that he trains, that he's obligated to ensure that his son receives whatever education is necessary to prepare him for his adulthood. And that's what it means. And it's incumbent on the father. There is a minority of scholars who say actually it is an obligation of the son, but it's not an obligation for which he can be held clearly culpable if he doesn't carry it out. There's no culpability in a child. And when we say it's an obligation on the son, it's actually an obligation on the son. It's a little bit difficult to understand, but that falls in with the Lashon. It says here that the cotton was chayav. In all our discussions, we're generally going to take the other view, that it is the father who has a mitzvah of chinuch and not the child. Second. Let's go on now and start the Gemara. Okay, we'll see. Some of the discussions will come out in the Gemara, even though they could already have been pre-stated when I did the Mishnah. The Gemara says, first of all, Pshita, it's obvious. What's obvious? And by the way, you always know that when the Gemara says it's obvious and you don't know what's obvious, we just learned a Mishnah which had several parts. And the first word of the Mishnah, of Gemara, to discuss it, it says that Mishnah is obvious. Which part of the Mishnah is obvious, right? So this is one of the reasons that you can get a nervous breakdown when you learn Gemara, because the Gemara doesn't specify what it's talking about. You can tell from the answer very often. You cannot stop at a word that you get stuck in the Gemara. You just carry on. And from the answer, you can see the question. You have to work back from the answer to the question. So where Talmud is learned. The Gemara says it is obvious. What is obvious? We'll see that from the answer, it's obvious the din of the Mishnah that says that a woman should be able to receive the lulav and esrog from her son or her husband, and it's not muktzah, says the Gemara. Well, obviously it's not muktzah. Well, I explained to you before what the concern was, but that is going to be now enunciated here in the Gemara. But the Gemara says it's obvious that a woman can take and hold on a Shabbos this lulav and esrog after her husband has done the mitzvah, and it's not muktzah for her. So why then did the Mishnah have to mention it? Remember, classic tactic of the Gemara. When the Mishnah educates you about something which is deemed to be obvious, then the Gemara will always ask Pshita. Mishnah isn't there to teach you the obvious. The Mishnah is there to teach you something you would not otherwise have known. So now the Gemara explains why it is not obvious, and the Mishnah had to teach us that a woman doesn't have to worry about muktzah when she receives the lulav. The Gemara says this, Mahu detema. No, the reason why it's not obvious and it needed to be mentioned in the Mishnah is because I might have thought, Dehoil the Isha lav bas chiyuvahi, that since a woman doesn't have, as I said before, a full obligation to take lulav and esrog, it's a mitzvah aseh shazman groma, it's a time-bound mitzvah. If she takes it in the form of, as the Gemara describes, eino mitzvah v'osa. She's not commanded, but she does it anyway. But she has no chiyuv, there's no tzivui, because as a woman, she is exempt from that mitzvah. So therefore, eima lo tekabel. Therefore, I might have thought she's not allowed to take the lulav and esrog from her husband. Her husband had to put it back into the vase himself. She mustn't touch it because she has no function to perform with it, since she has no commandment to take lulav and esrog. That's what I might have thought. Therefore, Kamash Malon says the Gemara, the Mishnah therefore had to tell you that she can take the lulav and esrog. Because you might have thought she shouldn't be able to because she doesn't really have a Torah obligation. Therefore, the Mishnah had to say, no, you're wrong. She is able to handle the lulav and esrog, even though she doesn't have a full Torah obligation. Why? Why she should be able to? If she hasn't got an obligation, maybe it should be muktzah. Maybe our mystery here is, maybe the Mahu de Tema is correct. Maybe she shouldn't be able to take it. So, I mean, I tried to explain this before, but there are actually two explanations given as to why the woman may be allowed to take the lulav, despite the fact that she doesn't have a Torah obligation. It's interesting, Rashi brings one response, which is not the one I gave you before, which seems a bit surprising. Let me start with Rashi. Rashi says, you know why this woman is allowed to handle the lulav and esrog, even though she's not obligated, after her husband and her son have already made their brachas. You know why? Because it's not muktzah. Why is it not muktzah? Surely she's not obligated. She has no mitzvah. Should it not be muktzah for her? Says Rashi, the reason it's not muktzah for her is because it's not muktzah for the men. This is an interesting principle. So Rashi is saying, even though the woman who handles it herself has no function to perform with it, since there are men in the world who are allowed to handle a lulav and esrog, therefore the lulav and esrog by definition is not muktzah for anyone. That's Rashi. Rashi doesn't say it's because she herself can make a bracha and do a mitzvah. No, Rashi doesn't say that at all. Rashi accepts that the woman has no obligation. And there's a very strong argument to make that this is muktzah on her because she herself personally can get no benefit from it. But he brings us into what would seem to be a general rule that it isn't muktzah just because an individual doesn't have use for it, as long as others do have. And since the whole male species has a mitzvah of taking lulav and esrog, therefore, by definition, the lulav and esrog isn't muktzah, even though she may have no personal function for it. Her own personal non-need doesn't make it muktzah, because mankind in general has a need. Mankind, meaning, if you like, the gender of mankind himself has a need for it, takes it out of the category of muktzah. That's Rashi. That's why it's not muktzah. Very interesting. Rabbeinu Tam, it would seem, has a different look at this based upon his own opinion, which he expresses elsewhere. Rabbeinu Tam, upon whom we as Ashkenazim rely anyway, says that a woman is allowed to make a bracha on any mitzvah. For example, she makes a bracha on lulav and esrog and on sukkah and everything else. Actually, the Sephardim don't. The Sephardim say a mitzvah aseh shehazman groma, which a woman doesn't have to keep. She doesn't make a bracha. So according to the Sephardim, a woman will take lulav and esrog, but without a bracha completely. But Rabbeinu Tam says that she may even make a bracha, and our women, if you like, in the Ashkenazi world, work on that basis, that they do make a bracha before nearly every mitzvah that they perform, even if those mitzvahs are really only obligated on men, min haTorah. So that's a fact. So it turns out, certainly according to Rabbeinu Tam, that even those mitzvahs which are aseh shazman garoma, a woman, when she fulfills them, are, if you like, big enough mitzvahs for her that she can make a bracha on. Because otherwise, how can she say Asher Kedishana b'mitzvah sabit sivonim? It's a bit of, if you think about it, it's contradiction. We say that she's not commanded min haTorah to do it, and yet in the bracha we say you have sanctified us and you have commanded us. It's a bit of a contradiction. Yet the fact that she's allowed to make a bracha shows that certainly, according to Rabbeinu Tam, her taking of the lulav and esrog, for example, is considered to be a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah that she was commanded on, but it's one she's voluntarily taken upon herself. So according to Rabbeinu Tam, you don't have to learn like Rashi. Why is it that the woman can take the lulav and esrog from her husband? Rashi said only because other men have a mitzvah. Rabbeinu Tam would say no, it's because she herself has a mitzvah. If she can make a bracha on it, then she herself has use on it. Now, it may not be at the level of min haTorah. Only men have the mitzvah at the level of min haTorah. But even the level that she has of she'ena mitzvah, that she's not commanded, the discretionary mitzvah she takes upon herself is sufficiently strong to say that there is use in this mitzvah, in this lulav and esrog. It is not useless. It's not a stone for her. And therefore she makes a bracha. So it's because she herself has a use, according to Rabbeinu Tam. According to Rashi, she may take it because others have a use, even though she doesn't. It could be that, according to Rashi, his daughters wouldn't have been making a bracha or lulav and esrog, and he had a different philosophy for the extent to which a woman needs to carry out mitzvahs. Although you know that they say that Rashi's daughters wore tefillin, so it's difficult. Do they wore tefillin? It seems that women did take the mitzvahs very seriously in Rashi's household. A bit of a mystery there. However, these are the two ways of explaining why a woman may take the lulav and esrog from her husband, either because she has a personal mitzvah of some nature, according to Rabbeinu Tam, or because others have a mitzvah, even if she doesn't have. And that takes out the lulav and esrog from the category of being muktzah. Okay. Let's go on now with the Gemara. The Gemara now is going to discuss the case of cotton. Our Mishnah said simply that cotton hayon de'alananea chayav lulav, that a child who knows already how to do the shakes, so to speak, is obligated the lulav. We talked about whether it was her, the child, or whether it was the father, but the criterion of age is that that child already knows how to do the shaking. How old might that be? Probably maybe 4 or 5 or something. You know, they know how to do it. They've watched and they've seen, and they don't have to have their hands held. I mean, if you have to hold their hands and turn them around, then that's not cotton hayodeh. It means they know how to do this independently. So that's what the Mishnah says. And now the Gemara is bringing a brisa, which adds several other mitzvah activities and gives us the criteria for when the infant is obligated, depending upon each of these mitzvahs, what they involve. Tana Rabbanon, a rabbi's taught the following brisa: Kotan hayodea lenaneya chayav lulav. Well, that we saw in our Mishnah, but this is only the first stage in the brisa. It says exactly the same, that a minor, a small child who already knows how to do the shakings is obligated, as we say, because of chinuch, in the mitzvah of lulav. Now, next case, lehisateif, a child that knows how to cover himself over, wrap himself around. What does that mean? It doesn't tell you with what. With a talis. A child that already knows how to wrap himself around the correct way with a talis. Chayov betzitzis. Let's go on. We'll look at these cases separately, but let's just go on. There's a package here. Lishmor tefillin. A child who knows how to look after his tefillin, which means he knows how to treat them respectably. He knows not just how to put them on, but he knows he mustn't take them into places that are unclean, but he should have clear thoughts, etc., because the tefillin are very holy. And because you may wear tefillin on for quite a long period of time. A child that's already at that more mature level, he has to, he's obligated, aviv lokeach lo tefillin. His father has to buy for him a set of tefillin and needs to have his own tefillin. We'll discuss that. This is already not the way we practice nowadays, when we only give tefillin to a young man a few months before his bar mitzvah. This particular brisa suggests you would start earlier on, and therefore the halacha doesn't follow. That's just interesting to know. Yodeh ledaber, as soon as he knows how to speak, what does that mean? So the Mefarshim say he has to, doesn't mean mommy, daddy, or whatever it is, or more. It means he has to be able to undertake some very simple conversation. Then, Aviv lomdo Torah or Kriya Shema. His father's obligated to teach him Torah. What does that mean? Some level of Torah or Kriya Shema. We'll see what we mean by Torah in a moment. The Brisa will itself explain. It's not going to teach him, the complex Torah or Torah Shabbal Peh. Or Kriya Shema, and teaches him Kriya Shema. Kriya Shema is also a form of Torah, but it's also a form of Tefillah. And what do we mean by Kriya Shema? It's quite clear that we don't mean the whole of Kriya Shema. We mean that first sentence, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which is the passage which constitutes Kabbalas Ol Malchus Shemaim, where we accept the yoke of heaven. That is the formally most important statement of Kriya Shema. And one is Yotze, even with that one sentence Kriya Shema, even if one doesn't say the rest. So that's the bit that he has to do. And here we must be talking about someone maybe around 4 years old, who is able, maybe 3 years old, depends how bright they are really. Here we're not giving ages. In a sense, we're talking here about their functioning capacity. It'll depend upon the child. A child who's very forward will be able to start on these earlier on. A child that is slower will start on these things when he is ready. That's what the Mishnah is saying. I just wanted to, I don't know if I can get this on, I'm just going to share screen with you, have a little bit of fun for a short time. I know you're getting very bored, so. Where is it? 1 second, I'm just going to lose you for a moment. Okay. Okay. Didn't work. I'm going to close that. I may have to share and stop sharing. 1 second. Oh, okay. Can you see the screen? Yeah, I'm sure you can. We're going to watch a movie. It's movie time. The reason I'm going to share a movie with you is because we mentioned the earliest criterion for a child putting on talis is when he knows how to wrap himself round. So here is Rabbi Yoni Birnbaum, who's a good Englishman, telling you how to put a talis on.
Today I'm going to demonstrate how to put on a talit, a prayer shawl, that's traditionally worn by Jewish men during the daily morning service. We begin by taking the talit out of the bag, like so. Place it over one's shoulder. Check the strings, make sure they're all in place. And we unravel the shawl, place it over the head just like so, and make the following blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu behit atef b'tzitzit. Then we place it over the head, gather up all 4 corners, throw them over the left shoulder for a couple of seconds, then place the talit in position on the shoulders, like so, with 2 strings in front and 2 behind. Some people don't do the full wrapping of the tallit. Instead, after holding it over their shoulders, they just place it over the eyes, just like this. And then place it on their shoulders in the manner I've described before. And that's how you put on the tallit, the Jewish people.
Okay. Wasn't that fun? Right. Why did I show you that? Only because when we talked about the criterion of a child being able to wrap himself around with a tallis, that sounds really as though it was a nothing. You know, you just put something over your head. There is a formal way of doing it in the procedure. And what we're seeing is that a child should be able to do that procedure before he gets a tallis. And it's not such a small set of actions over here. You have to have some body self-awareness and positioning to be able to do that. It took me a while. I still don't sometimes know which is my left shoulder or my right shoulder. How high is it over the head, etc. The Sephardim actually do a slightly different ituf, I understand. Why do we do an ituf like this, by the way? Isn't it a rather strange way of wrapping yourself around in the tallis? And you only hold it during the moments that you're making the bracha, then you just put it over your shoulder. So the answer is, according to the Gemara, this is called ituf yishma'eli. This is following the way in which Arabs wrap themselves around. We model ourselves on the Arabian custom of putting on a cloak. And you imagine this from, you know, Lawrence of Arabia or Arabian Nights. This is the way they would put their cloaks over themselves in the desert to wrap themselves away from the sandstorms coming in their direction. They would cover themselves over. So it's a very interesting idea. But that formally is the way one should carry out ituf, to do the bracha properly. And that's what a child has to be able to know before he's actually obligated with a din of talus. The next case was a lishmor tefillin. And I said to you that the Brisa seemed to suggest as soon as a child knows how to look after his tefillin in a respectable manner, he's not given he's not given a set of tefillin. But on the criterion of the Brisa, that might actually be achieved at age 9 or 10. I mean, at the age of 9 or 10, the child certainly knows what is right, what is wrong, what is holy, what is profane, what is suitable and appropriate to do with tefillin, what isn't. He may have gone to a tefillin workshop and seen what goes into a tefillin. So according to the Brisa, he's ready to have a set of tefillin for himself, and therefore he should put on tefillin daily. However, it is the universal custom not to do this and to wait until the child is just a few months before his tefillin. Some say 30 days or 3 months or whatever it is. Some maybe only 7 days. But the point is to bring him into the mitzvah tefillin very late on the grounds that the tefillin have extra kedusha. And we don't trust ourselves nowadays, even adults really, to be able to wear their tefillin in a state of pristine holiness. And therefore we delay the time at which we get tefillin for our kids. I should actually go back to the tallis as well, shouldn't I really? I just remember now. Do we buy a tallis for our kids when they're young? We just said a moment ago that from when they know how to do ituf, they're obligated in tallis. When the Mishnah said here, the Brisa said tallis, it wasn't meaning talit katan. Not the tallis cotton you wear under your vest. You don't do all that throwing around on the tallis cotton, never. You just put it straight over. You make a bracha as a child, put it on your shoulders and put your shirt on top, that's it. Here we're talking about mitzvah of a talit gadol. And the particular brisa here is following the custom that you can get you can bring your child into the wearing of a tallis at an early age. And of course the yekas, certain groups of Jews buy taletim for their kids at a young age. There are some groups who would get it when the child is bar mitzvah, whereas in other groups it's when they get married. I didn't wear a tallis on until I got married, the day I got married. Others will be able to do so at an even earlier age, at 9 or 10. And that seems to be the way the Brisa suggests over here. Someone who already knows how to wrap themselves around gets a tallis. So there are variants in terms of the practice nowadays. And the Brisa seems to take an earlier view of the readiness of children to be inculcated to the mitzvahs than we necessarily do today. And the final case here was Yodeh ledaber aviv londo Torah kriya shema. Let's just do the next few lines. What do we mean by Torah? So here the Gemara says Torah. What does the Brisa mean when it says you teach him Torah? What parts of Torah do you teach a child who just about knows how to speak? So the answer is Maihi. What does it mean that you teach him Torah? So Amar Rav Hamanona said the following: you teach him this pasuk from Sefer Devarim, Torah tzivalonu Moshe Morosha Kihilas Yaakov. The first pasuk that you might teach a child when they grow up. One of the first pasukim. Torah tzivalonu Moshe. Torah was commanded to us by Moshe. Morosha, it is a heritage, Kihilas Yaakov, to the congregations of Jacob. That's Torah. You don't have to teach them any more than that. As soon as they can learn to talk a little bit, you teach them this verse. Why dafka this verse? Why not any other verse? So some say because it represents the chain of tradition. There's no verse that quite brings to our attention the shalshelis, the chain of tradition of teaching from father to son, from parent to child. Is this Torah was given to us as Morosha. Morosha is a heritage that's passed down from generation to generation. So you're teaching your child, you're actually engaged in this Masira process of handing down the Torah to the next generation. And Kriya Shema. What do we mean by Kriya Shema? Says the Gemara, when the Brisa says you teach him Kriya Shema, Maihi, what does that entail? And as I explained to you before, Pasuk Rishon. It only refers here to the Pasuk Rishon of Kriya Shema, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. So we're talking about a fairly young infant, and you've taught this infant Torah Tzivalon Moshe, Morosha Kilas Yaakov, and Kriya Shema, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Actually, it's interesting that Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad is also in the Torah. So actually, if you just teach them Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, you've taught them Torah and Kriya Shema, haven't you? But over here, it seems the Brisa thinks we should separate the two, really. The mitzvah Kriya Shema is very fundamental. The achdus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the unity of God. It's not something actually a small child understands. This pasuk of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, by the way, if you like, almost the most sophisticated statement in the whole Torah. You know, we might say God is one. What does it mean by God is one? Do you really understand what it means? God is a unity. Are you a Maimonidean philosopher? And yet that is the statement you teach a child right at the beginning. It's the Kabbalah's Olmach Ushman. Even though in a sense it's the most sophisticated of all the statements, much easier to tell him something which is, don't steal, be a good boy, never be jealous. Maybe that's what we should teach our children. But no, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad has such fundamental importance to us. Even if the child doesn't understand it, it is the first prayer that we teach our child. And when it comes to Torah, it's Torah Tzivalonu Moshe, Morosha Kihilas Yaakov. Okay, I'm going to stop recording. If I can find the stop recording button.